Welcome back to Self-Invested, where we talk about how you can do better with money. This video is going to be different to the usual videos that I do. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about the cladding scandal, an issue that's affecting hundreds and thousands of people up and down the country. Now, as a first-time buyer, you might not directly be affected by this issue unless you're buying a property which is caught up in the cladding crisis. But this is an important issue for everyone because it has wider implications about building safety up and down the country. So the problem with fire safety and cladding on buildings became an undeniable problem after the Grenfell Tower fire in 2017, which claimed the lives of 72 people. But this wasn't the first warning sign that the industry and the government had that there was an issue with cladding on buildings. In 2009, there was a fire in Lakanal House in southeast London, which claimed 6 lives. The coroner that investigated the deaths found that the external envelope of the building was a contributing factor to the spread of the fire around that building, and said that the building regulations needed to be simplified in order to prevent a similar fire from happening. There was no action taken on this until after the Grenfell fire, which happened 8 years later. The Grenfell fire was just too big to ignore. It was just something that the building industry and the government had to respond to. They couldn't ignore it for any longer. When the government did investigate the issue, it found that the material that was being used to clad the building was highly flammable. So the material that was being used to clad Grenfell was called ACM, or aluminium composite material, and was made up of 2 metal sheets sandwiching a plastic sheet, and it was that plastic sheet in between which was extremely flammable. So when the government discovered that the cladding on the building was a major factor in how that fire spread, they decided to investigate what other buildings might be using this cladding. Now, when they started their investigation, they thought that they may find a few more buildings that had this cladding and be able just to remove it and get the job done. But what they found was that many more buildings than expected had this dangerous cladding on them. And not only did they have this dangerous cladding, they had other types of cladding which the building inspections found were not safe, and other defects within the buildings which pose serious fire safety risks. In order to address this issue, the government started to remove this dangerous cladding from buildings, and in 2019 made it law for these buildings to remove the dangerous cladding from their exterior. Now, this is where the problem began. This cost should have either fell on the building owners, who are the freeholders that own the building, or it should have fell on the developers, the people that built the buildings with this dangerous cladding. But instead, it fell on leaseholders who were completely innocent in the situation. They had bought their flats in good faith that they were built correctly and built safely. Even the government said that building safety is the responsibility of building owners, and if these costs need to be covered, then the building owners should go to the developers. But instead, building owners were putting the cost on leaseholders. And not just leaseholders that own their property outright, they were putting these costs on shared owners that in many cases only own 25% but were responsible for 100% of their flat share towards the removal cost of the cladding. Now, to make the situation worse, the finance industry and lenders lost confidence in building regulations, because clearly there'd been a failing in building regulations for the fact that so many buildings had been allowed to be built and to have this dangerous cladding on them. And they came up with their own assessment for assessing whether a building was safe. And this was known as the EWS1 form. This was a mandatory requirement for anybody that wanted to get a new mortgage on one of these flats in a tall building or a building that had cladding on it. The main problem with this was that because this was a completely new assessment, there weren't very many assessors that were qualified to carry out this assessment. Up until the end of last year, there was only 300 or around 300 surveyors that were qualified to carry out the survey. Now this is 300 surveyors for over 12,000 buildings that are 80 meters tall and a further 80,000 buildings between the heights of 11 meters and 18 meters. So far more buildings that required this survey than surveyors that were able to carry out the surveys. Now this has led to many issues with delays in people being able to get their buildings surveyed, and this has meant that they haven't been able to remortgage their properties, they haven't been able to sell their properties to somebody else who needs to get a mortgage to buy that property, and they haven't been able to move to their next step in the property ladder. Now there was another consequence of buildings being unsafe, and this was that they had to have wake-in watchers. For any building that failed their fire safety test, they were required to have a 24/7 wake-in watch, which is where you pay people to walk around your building for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This is an additional cost to leaseholders, an additional cost that costs hundreds of extra pounds every month. Now, as you can imagine, this has caused major issues for leaseholders. Not only have they got the financial worry about paying for wake-in watchers and paying for the remedial cost of removing cladding from their building, but there's also the worry that they can burn to death in their sleep because their building is so unsafe with this dangerous cladding on it. Well, there are many reasons for why this issue has happened. One is that there's been a failure of building regulations. This is where buildings have been built to the standard required by building regulations, but building regulations weren't adequate in terms of their level of fire safety or the fire safety that they need to provide. Also, there have been situations where buildings are non-compliant and have either been wrongfully signed off or haven't been signed off at all. And there's also been an issue with the testing of building materials, where building materials might not have been tested properly or adequately before being used on buildings. Now, a number of these issues appear to have happened with the Grenfell fires. For example, with building materials, there's a fire rating system from A to F for how they're rated. A is the highest standard and F is the lowest. Much of the industry before the fire at Grenfell thought that B was an adequate standard for buildings that were 18 meters tall, but it wasn't until after the fire that the government clarified that this wasn't the case, or this shouldn't have been the case, and the fire's rating standard that the building industry need to be working to for buildings 18 meters and taller is the highest standard of A. Now, with the cladding on Grenfell, it originally achieved a rating of B when it was first produced, but it was later downgraded to a C. But for some reason, the organisation that's responsible for issuing fire rating certificates in the UK wasn't notified that the rating of the cladding material that was used on Grenfell was downgraded from a B to a C. And to make the situation even worse, there was a certain configuration which was used on Grenfell, which when tested by the manufacturer actually achieved only a rating of E, which is the second to worst fire safety rating there is for building materials in the UK. So looking at that alone, it's easy to see how the fire could spread so quickly around Grenfell when the standard that they should have been working to, or the standard of material that should have been used on that building should have been A, but the material that was actually used on that building was actually E, the second worst fire rating possible on a building. People also believe that the issues that we're having now with building regulations and building safety is partly due to the deregulation that happened in the 1980s. For example, in 1984, there was legislation passed known as the Building Act, which allowed the building industry to essentially regulate itself. Now, previously, before this legislation was passed, only a local authority was allowed to inspect and sign off buildings to make sure that they met the safety standards that were required by building regulations. But after this act was passed, private organizations were then allowed to carry out these assessments. People were concerned with this at the time because they thought that there may be some conflict of interest here, because there's always the risk that if a building inspector is doing their job properly and really scrutinizing the safety and the plans of a building, then builders might not actually hire them to carry out their inspections because they're too thorough in their job, and will instead work with inspectors that would look on their plans and their buildings more favourably. So earlier this month, the government announced that for any leaseholders that were in buildings 18 metres or taller, they would not have to pay for the removal of cladding on their buildings, and that this cost would be covered by a levy or a tax that will be put onto the building industry to make them pay for the cost of remediating these buildings. However, they said that for leaseholders that were in buildings between 11 and 18 metres, they would only be given a loan to pay for the remediation work to their buildings. Now, many think that this loan is unfair because it's clear that leaseholders are not responsible for the issues to these buildings. And so why then are leaseholders in buildings between 11 and 18 metres tall still being forced to pay for the remediation work? Which I personally believe is a fair point. I don't see why any leaseholder should be made responsible for paying for the removal of cladding on their buildings when it wasn't their fault. It was clearly the fault of regulations or of the builders. It was definitely not the leaseholders. They're the most innocent party in this whole situation. So I just want to jump in here and add that it's not only leaseholders who are in buildings between 11 and 18 metres tall that feel let down by the government's recent announcement. The recent announcement only addressed one fire safety issue that's been identified in these building inspections. There are many other fire safety issues within these buildings, such as the lack of cavity wall barriers, and the government's recent announcement doesn't address any of these issues. In addition to this, leaseholders have been paying for and will continue paying for the cost of waking watchers until the cladding is taken down from their buildings. And this is a cost that they're paying which is not going to be reimbursed, even though they're paying for an issue which is no fault of their own. And to make this situation even worse, the cost of insurance for these buildings have also increased because these buildings are seen to be at greater risk of fires. And so the campaign to end the cladding scandal has not finished yet. Well, you can follow End Our Cladding Scandal on Twitter. Their handle is End Our Cladding Scandal. Or you can follow them on Facebook. You can just search End Our Cladding Scandal. If you want to go further and sign a petition to support their campaign, then you can go to their website, which is endourcladdingscandal.org, and there you can sign a petition to support the campaign. And also there's a template for a letter that you can send to your local MP to try and get them to support this campaign as well. That brings us to the end of the video. I hope I explained everything well. Please let me know down in the comments if there was anything I didn't explain very well that you need me to elaborate on or just explain better. And if you have any comments about the situation, make sure you leave a comment down below. Anyway, I'll see you in the next video. Take care. Bye.